Hey guys, I'm Yegi Shatini, and today I wanted to go over how I implemented the boss background music for our game Chroma that you could download on Steam. My last video is talking about the different levels before the boss, which was a little simpler, but this video will be focused solely on the boss itself. Like before, I find the most important thing is to just document and write out what you're doing in particular. So for this one, it is just for our final boss. We wanted to make that background music a little more intricate. So just like before, we want that constant energy-filled background music. Drum and bass is our primary reference, and the music we're using, same thing goes for here. Now, the boss itself will have phases, and we know this going into the game design, so we need to keep that in mind as far as how we implement the music itself. So it'll be a little different than we did for the levels. General disclaimer, again, this is only the boss background music implementation. If you want to see the other normal levels, check out my last video, and it goes over all of that, which is a little simpler. And like always, there are tons of ways to create this background system. I think even now we'll talk about later, but if I went back, I would do it a little differently. But there are tons of ways to do things, and that's part of the fun in doing this. Now, we have our boss level starts. This is just for one level itself. Our triggers will be, we'll say 60% and 30% when the boss hits lower health, just because those are easier numbers to work with. And then once those triggers, or once those marks are hit, that will change the phase. And now this was happening in the code itself. I just kind of hijacked that area of the blueprint to also call the switch for the background music to change phases. Our last video showed this. This is kind of how we were dealing with each level. This would just go on repeat. Now the boss is itself, but since we have 3 phases, we are just kind of expanding that to be 3 parts. Within each one, let's say you're taking 10 minutes to get the boss to trigger to phase 2, it is going to be repeating phase 1 over and over. Same thing with phase 2 and phase 3. But this is the general concept of it. The same thing we did before, but we're now controlling 3 separate phases. So in Wwise, let's take a look at what we're doing here for the boss. Now we'll see we have an actual switch container. So again, this isn't a Wwise tutorial, but to make a switch container, you just go to new child, and instead of a playlist container like we did before, we have a switch container that's controlling playlist containers. Now, everything we went over last time is still the same. So as far as our game states of being, there is no actual shop, because once you beat the boss, you beat the game. So this much isn't going to be relevant, but player health is still a thing. If you die in the boss room, you're going to get low passed and go to restart the game kind of back from the beginning in traditional roguelike fashion. So our switch container is controlling whether we're in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. Now, as far as triggering those, we just have our game state. Now the state group has phase 1, 2, and 3, of course, and in the blueprint itself of the boss, when we switch to phase 1, I just call to set state to phase 1 and so on. And I'm not showing any of the blueprints for this. If you are curious of that side, then let me know, and I'll show you some of the Unreal Engine blueprints for how I called these changes, but this is just a simple one node set state. All right, so we start the boss with phase 1. Now, inside of phase 1, if I were only looking at this, Prism 1, this looks identical to what we did before with our other implementation. We have our ad-lib stuff, right, our little extra melodies. Right, various little synth stuff going on in the background just to spice things up. And then we have the rest of our tracks. We have our bass, drums, other, and this one was split into vocals, but again, there are no actual vocals. It's just some random instrumental stems that were broken apart. But yeah, overall, it's still kind of the same general idea between these 3. And then 1B. Ooh. Right, so just like before, inside of this playlist for 1A, I'm just doing a A, B, A, C kind of thing, and that's just going to repeat and go back and forth throughout. Now, one thing I mentioned how I would do this differently is you'll see this 1A is set to 32 bars. That was just kind of how I bounced it. I didn't think back at it. I'd have definitely made it 16, if not 8, just so it could switch a little more and when we transition to segments. Because one thing you'll find is, say you're only 5 bars in and you trigger phase 2, you have to go through all 32 bars. Now, it's not too bad considering we're at 176 BPM. That does go by fairly quickly, but it isn't as instant as I would change it. You can use transitions for this and again kind of have it transition to the next part in the middle of a segment and so on. But again, as far as the implementation that I did for this, I just kind of went with the traditional way that we did in the levels and then added the switch container to it. If I look at 1B, same idea here. 1C, same idea here. It's all the same before. So let's say now we switch to phase 2. So now phase 1, Prism 1 basically doesn't exist anymore. I'm now in phase 2. The boss can't go back to phase 1. So the switch is just going back through. You can call it to go back to phase 1 if your game, say, has regenerating health on your boss, and it would go back. For phase 2, I kept it pretty simple because for us it was a smaller portion of health. I think of the 3 segments, this was the smallest segment you'd be in. So there is only one music segment here. There's just 2A. Different part of the track, noticeably different, unlike kind of how it would be if this was like a 1D section. It's a different part of the track, different rhythm, different beat. I spiced up some of the drum parts a little bit. All that's inside of the DAW, not through here. And then the ad-libs for 2A is also the same as the ad-libs on the Prism 1 section, just because it is still part of the same track. It's in the same key and same BPM. So this is all effectively a 1D section, but I needed to make it clear that this was inside of phase 2 music. So this would repeat, again, 32 beat section. This one was fine because, again, it's only this one. It's not going to be trying to repeat between a 2A and 2B. Now, when you got the boss down to phase 3, phase 2 music ceases to exist, and it loads in 3A, which again is just its own thing. But here it's a completely different track by the same person, but this is like your final push to the end. We wanted to keep it big, so I didn't add too much more. In this case, the ad-libs is more of a constant melodic phrase going on. And this is what would play and loop until the end, when it would fade out once you kill the boss. Hopefully you've killed the boss if you played the game, but it would trigger your ending cinematic and then kind of fade into that music. So that's all the switch container really does. Most of the stuff was in Prism 1. Right, this is identical to how I treated all the other levels, but I didn't feel the need to do that for all Prism 2 and Prism 3, just to, keep adding variants. By the time you got to phase 2, you're kind of pushing and trying to win. Phase 1 is like the easiest, so you'd spend the longest time there, so I felt it necessary to have the A, B, and C section. For the other ones, again, it's just a straight loop, doing the same section back and forth. So again, with our phase just here, 1, 2, and 3, this is what's being called. It goes straight 1, 2, 3, no fancy backtracking or extra phases that way. Again, you can do that with your with any of these switch groups. You could switch it whenever you want, wherever you want. So you could go in different orders, but as far as we're concerned, we just went straight from 1, 2, and 3. I showed the Soundcaster session for the generator room before, but it's kind of the same thing for the prism room. There's no additional things here. It would just change where you change the phases. Now, one big thing here is that you have phase 1 going. If I switch to phase 2, like I mentioned in, it being 32 bars, it's going to continue going. My computer lagged a bit there, but it won't actually go to phase 2 until the end of phase 1, and then it plays phase 2. Even if you trigger phase 3, it's kind of queued up, and then once you get to the end of that is when it switches. So it will always finish the phrase and then switch. So it's not going to be like a hard cut. And then even in some cases with the game itself, the boss has to finish what it's doing, then it roars and does its own phase switching. So for us, this was like the cleanest way to incorporate that. But that's handling background music with switch groups. This is, again, just kind of like the next step, I feel, in terms of Wwise and getting background music a little more dynamic and playing. So if you have any questions on any of the other systems we used, whether it's going more in depth on these background music systems or some of the other parts of the game, it's a roguelike, so there's a lot of cool switches and interesting things happening with other parts of the game. Feel free to let me know, subscribe, and you'll see all the new other stuff I post about different audio I've been working on. I do have one other project I have with a lot more complex background music system than that, so be on the lookout for that if you're interested in something a little more complex. Than very game dependent. That one's a lot more story based. And then, of course, following these, we'll have just doing these natively inside of Unreal Engine if you don't want to use Wwise directly. So if that's something you're interested in, be sure to keep in touch and watch out for more videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.